Welcome to History 2020. My name is Dr. Sawyer. I'll be your professor for today and hopefully for the rest of the semester. We've shifted to mornings for this lecture. It's like the good old days. It's like the good old days back in Ag Hall. You guys ever been in Ag Hall? Ag Hall was terrible, and then they renovated, and somehow it got worse. I don't understand. There used to be a stage, now there's a closet. What was in the closet? A horse that was stolen. Okay, let me clarify. Not a real horse. Horse picture. The Admiral Stebby that was stolen from one of my classrooms a while back. Stolen by who? The man. So, welcome to class. One of the unfortunate things about having such limited time in this class is that there's just a lot of stories I would like to tell, a lot more, like a lot of evidence we'd like to get deeper into. What I'm trying to do with these lectures, since literally there's this one and two more after it, I'm trying to make the big connections. I will be happy to answer any questions. Like I can make, if you guys have any questions about readings to add on to this, I'll be happy to share those with you. As I said before, the information that I'm telling you, right? The information is not mine. I don't own it, right? It's out there. It's available. And if you know how to actually vet sources, then you can find it. What I've tried to do, and a big part of my job as a historian, is knowing that stuff, but then trying to make the connections, trying to help you guys understand the big picture and where we are. And so that's what I'm trying to do. So for the last lecture, for the next few, to the end of the semester, that's what I'll be gunning for. And if you have any questions, or you want readings, or you want me to put more in between, I'll be happy to do that, either on D2L or somewhere else. Does that make sense? It's so hard. It's so hard. Last time we talked about television and society. Eisenhower's military-industrial complex speech was really important there. One of the things that I want you guys to think about here as well, and it relates to modern debates we have, it fascinates me the way that so many people have this idea that the government is bad or government kills jobs. Now, I'm not here telling you at all that government is always good. There's no way. But people totally underestimate the impact that the U.S. government has on our economy. We forget these things. Like, for example, interstates. Interstates were a federal program. Interstates were a federal program that the American businesses were able to build off of, the transportation, shipping, all of these things. The funding for universities that goes into, that the private workforce needs. You've got energy with the development of, atomic energy. You have, and later on, you're going to have the internet. Guys, don't ever believe somebody who's like, it's all good or it's all bad. Sometimes it's a better idea to pull money together. Also, sometimes it's a better idea not to, right? So again, one of the things with this class is for me never to give you a conclusion to things, but it is to get you to know better than to fall into these ideological holes. Yeah, maybe moving forward, every decision about how to solve a problem would be a bad idea for the government to solve it. Possibly, but here's the thing. We can't make that statement now because we haven't gotten to those questions yet. Remember, if you think you have a solution before you've looked at the problem, you don't have a science, you have a religion. So, that's just something to think about, tying things together for the last few lectures. We got to the 1960 election. And we talked about the myth of the television debate. And we left off with a test that was given to keep black folks from voting, basically a poll test. And today we'll pick up and we'll go from there. And today, guys, we are going to go from the civil rights movement to space, back to Earth, and to Vietnam. Are you ready? If we don't make it, tell our moms we love them. Civil rights. Let's talk about this. We've covered this. I gave you the documentary on the Black Panthers to look at. We talked about ways that black folks are kept away from voting before. Just a quick rundown. 1954, you guys all know this. Brown versus the Board of Education ruled that segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. This begins to unravel the previous ruling from the 1890s, Plessy versus Ferguson. And gradually you see that the Supreme Court in these years is going to play a pivotal role in putting teeth back in the 14th Amendment. In Tennessee, it's not until 1952 that the first black student is admitted to UT Knoxville. Not until 1957 that Tennessee passes legislation requiring desegregation of state universities. Every law is only as good as its enforcement. You can pass all the laws in the world. if nobody's there to see the crime and no one's there to actually enforce the law, then, what's it even mean? And you can see that, and there are also informal institutions, right? These cultural norms, these structures, non-state violence and coercion. These all play a role in it. And I think it's interesting. It's not until May of 1965 that MTSU, our university, has its first graduate. It was a black woman, and that's our first black graduate. So you're talking about an 8-year gap between when Tennessee, the legislature said that the schools had to be desegregated and when you have the first black graduate. I will also remind you that in 1954, Brown versus the Board of Education ruled that schools must be desegregated with all deliberate speed. That is vague, and states drag and cities drag their feet on it. There's a portion of Virginia that just shuts down its entire school system for years to prevent integration. There is violence. Here in Nashville, Tennessee, schools were bombed. I went to a talk at the Nashville Public Library about a year or two ago, and it was on school integration. It was by a historian who didn't live through it, so she was writing about it. And in the audience was a woman who was part of the first cohort of black folks to integrate her school in Nashville, and that was the 1970s. So this is not an even pattern. Some places move faster than others, but certainly there's a lot of backlash there. We'll come back to that because Brown versus the Board, this whole civil rights movement, is part of a greater context. I think that we often think of people who fight integration, like the segregationists, as just dumb and saying, I think that black people are worse than white people, and don't definitely think those things, and a lot of those people say those things. But I want you to see how power actually works here. Now, this is a speech by George Wallace. George Wallace was the governor of Alabama. Really fascinating character. Have you guys ever heard of George Wallace before? Yeah. 1958, George Wallace runs for governor of Alabama and loses. And afterwards, he says to someone that he won't be out inwarded again. George Wallace, for a long time, had been recognized as someone who was more progressive on race. This guy, when he was coming up, was a lawyer. He worked in the Alabama court system, and black lawyers who worked with him later on recounted that George Wallace had been one of the most decent people to them in the courtroom, that he had demanded other people respect him. But when he runs for politics and loses in 58, he decides that the only way to win in Alabama is to go all in on segregation. Now, it's a complicated issue. Southern states are claiming that the federal government enforcing civil rights laws infringes on their states' rights. In July of 1964, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is passed. George Wallace comes out on July 4th, 1964, and gives a speech called The Civil Rights Movement, Fraud, Hoax, and Sham. So I'm just going to read a little bit, and I want you to listen to this in the way that it's phrased, okay? Because this is his speech he gives in response to the 1964 Civil Rights Act, all right? We come here today in defense to the memory of those stalwart patriots who on July 4th, 1776, pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor to establish and defend the proposition that governments are created by the people, empowered by the people, derive their just powers from the consent of the people, and must forever remain subservient to the will of the people. Today, 188 years later, we celebrate that occasion and find inspiration and determination and courage to preserve and protect the great principles of freedom enunciated in the Declaration of Independence. Sounds like a great July 4th Day speech, right? But wait. It is therefore a cruel irony that the President of the United States has only yesterday signed into law the most monstrous piece of legislation ever enacted by the United States Congress. It is a fraud, a sham, and a hoax. This bill will live in infamy. To sign it into law at any time is tragic. To do so upon the eve of the celebration of our independence insults the intelligence of the American people. And I'm going to go down a little bit here. Never before in the history of this nation have so many human and property rights been destroyed by a single enactment of the Congress. It is an act of tyranny. It is the assassin's knife stuck in the back of liberty. With this assassin's knife and a blackjack in the hand of the federal force cult, the left-wing liberals will try to force us back into bondage. Bondage to a tyranny more brutal than that imposed by the British monarchy, which claimed power to rule over the lives of our forefathers under sanction of the divine right of kings. Today, this tyranny is imposed by the central government, which claims the right to rule over our lives under sanction of the omnipotent black-robed despots who sit on the bench of the United States Supreme Court. This bill is fraudulent in intent and design and in execution. To illustrate the fraud, it is not a civil rights bill. It is a federal penal code. It creates federal crimes which would take volumes to list and years to tabulate because it affects the lives of 192 million American citizens. Every person in every walk and station of life and every aspect of our daily lives becomes subject to the criminal provisions of the bill. It threatens our freedom of speech, of assembly, or association, and makes the exercise of these freedoms a federal crime. Yet there are those who call this a good bill. It is people like Senator Hubert Humphrey and other members of Americans for Democratic Action. It is people like Ralph Miguel and other left-wing radical apologists. If I just read that to you, if I just read what I read to you, would you be able to pick what I was talking about? Would you know that I was talking about a law to uphold the civil rights of human beings? Where in here does he use the N-word? I'll tell you, not at all. Where in here does he say anything about black folks? Where does he say anything about white superiority? Moving on. I am having nothing to do with enforcing a law that would destroy our free enterprise system. I have nothing to do with enforcing law that will destroy neighborhood schools. I'm having nothing to do with enforcing a law that will destroy the rights of private property. I'm having nothing to do with the so-called civil rights bill. The liberal left-wingers have passed it. Now let them employ some pink-nick social engineers in Washington, D.C. to figure out what to do with it. Here's the amazing thing about this. A lot of times we think that the people who argued against the civil rights movement, the people who argued on the side of segregation, we think they were just out there screaming the N-word, yelling at people, attacking people. But this is how you use the power of American rhetoric on the side of the most awful things. It happens a lot. He's evoking the narrative I've been telling you guys about. He evokes the Declaration of Independence, America's struggle against British tyranny, and in this context says, hey, this is exactly what the federal government's doing with the Civil Rights Act. They're telling us what to do, right? Isn't this who we are as Americans? We hate tyranny. We hate a strong central government coming in and telling us what to do. It's pretty remarkable. Now, just so you guys know what he sounds like.
Today, I have stood where once Jefferson Davis stood and took an oath to my people. It is very appropriate that from this cradle of the Confederacy, this very heart of the great Anglo-Saxon Southland, that today we sound the drum for freedom, as have our generation of forebears before us done time and again down through history. Let us rise to the call of freedom-loving blood that is in us, and send our answer to the tyranny that clanks its chains upon the South. In the name of the greatest people that have ever trod this earth, I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny, and I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
Just in case anyone goes, well, that speech about civil rights, maybe he just really did care about American freedom. But did you see him evoke in this other speech, the segregation forever speech, which is one of his most famous speeches? This guy is using the power of American rhetoric, the American Revolution, and all of that to justify his position. And so I want you guys to see this, to know that the way this works is not as straightforward as someone just coming out and saying, I am a racist. George Wallace had national ambitions. He figured out how to wordsmith his message in a way that would appeal to people outside of the South. And it worked totally. But there were people outside of the South who heard his message and were like, yeah, we should be able to send kids to the school we want to. And I think one could argue, and actually this has been documented actually in Jefferson Cowie's book, Staying Alive, the way that people saw this rhetoric, and people who absolutely had no interest in supporting segregation or racism just thought it was wrong that people should be able to go to schools, you know, because that was their schools. They moved to that neighborhood to go to that school, and they didn't think other people should be coming in there. Wallace was a wordsmith. Another side story about him, which is fascinating. He could only serve so long in office. And so after his term limit was up, his wife ran for governor of Alabama. And she ended up winning. When she was running in the middle of that race, she was feeling bad. She went to the doctor, and the doctor diagnosed her as having cancer. In the 1960s, it was totally possible for a man who was married to go in and get that diagnosis and decide not to tell the woman what happened. George Wallace found out his wife had cancer and asked the doctor, don't tell her. And so they kept the information that she had cancer away from her. That's nuts. Just so you guys know, this is the 60s. Have you guys ever looked at pharmaceutical companies from the 1960s and the ads? This is from the late 1960s. It's for an antidepressant. Read this. You can't set her free, but you can help her feel less anxious. You guys see the imagery? She's like in the house behind bars, right? To help you relieve anxiety and tension. Now she can cope. Everyday sedative for everyday situational stress. The fascinating thing to me about this is that, just to go back to the George Wallace thing, what you see in this, who is this one aimed at? Is it marketed towards the woman in the picture?
It's marketed towards the husband.
Yeah. It's an ad aimed at men to put their wives on medication. In terms of connecting things and putting things together, we have limited time, but I think you just got a sneak peek into why the women's rights movement starts. This is life in the 1960s, and these are from the late 60s. That's one of the reasons why women are going to be so furious, is that men have incredibly strong rights over women's health, over their bodies. And again, this is one of these amazing things that we can't quite get into, but I will say here, sometimes I hear students complaining about older female faculty members, and they'll say, man, she's just so mean. She's just so hard. Like, she's just not nice. And here's what I would like for all of you to remember. You know how when you look around in the classroom at the university, you see lots of women in the classroom? And you know how when you go to meet with your professors, a lot of your smart, brilliant professors are female? Wasn't like that 50, 60 years ago. And that first generation that broke down the walls, they had to be hard as nails to make that happen. So, yeah, you know what? The women that came in and broke down the doors of the university in the 1960s, 1970s, even into the 1980s, man, they fought centuries of suppression of women's rights, and they won. So don't be surprised when they ain't got time for your
garbage.
I think that's fair. Sorry. All right, so we'll move on. Going back to the rhetoric of Wallace, the idea that this is really just about freedom. It's not at all about racism. I mean, maybe it is, but when we're talking to the national audience, we can't say that. And this is another shift here. The 1964 election. Barry Goldwater runs in 1964 for the Republican presidency. Goldwater is destroyed in the 64 election. I mean, absolutely destroyed by Lyndon Baines Johnson. But Goldwater, and this, there's a debate over how much he was trying to actually target segregationists. That doesn't even need to be part of the conversation to actually show you something. Goldwater is all about small government, limited government. He actually is going to be the guy that inspires a lot of the thinking of the new right, Ronald Reagan and those folks. And until very recently, the Republican Party kind of came out of this, our modern Republican Party. But his whole point is the government's gotten too big. It's in our way. We need to break down the size of the government and allow people to have more liberties. Okay, so if I say that again, it sounds a little bit like what George Wallace said, huh? If I say that in 1964, whatever I mean by it, it's in the context of the Civil Rights Movement. It's in the context of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Who do you think might hear a message like, hey, the government's too big, we need to get them out of our way, and be very receptive to that message? That's right, segregationists. So here's the thing. This is the year Dwight Eisenhower, one of the most incredibly popular presidents this country has seen. This is the year he ran in 56 for his second election. Notice where he didn't win. Just the South, and even Tennessee, like Virginia, they went with him. Just the deep South, really, and up into Missouri, because the Democrats dominated that area, right? Had for 100 years at this point. Now, notice 1964, the year the Republican presidential candidate says, we need smaller government, we need less federal power, and something really interesting happens. For the first time in like 100 years, the South and the Deep South votes for a Republican. If you look at Goldwater's rhetoric, it sounds a lot like Wallace's rhetoric. While not as specifically aimed at segregation, you can see this happening. You guys remember Strom Thurmond, the guy who in 1948 ran for president on the Dixiecrat ticket, right? Remember that night? He was like, yeah, you know what? All I got really is just keep white folks and black people apart. Remember that guy? Well, in 1964, he leaves the Democratic Party and becomes a Republican. He's going to be followed by a lot of those folks. Now, some of them are going to stay on in the Democratic Party for a long time. But folks like Strom Thurmond from South Carolina, later on Jesse Helms from North Carolina, they're going to start jumping ship. Pretty fascinating, huh? Remember how I told you that as much as we might not like this to be the answer, that actually civil rights and racism had a lot to do with the South going from being solidly Democratic to solidly Republican? It's happening here. However, it's not going to be until Richard Nixon that somebody actually figures out, actually, we can aim this message at the South and really pull them in. It's Nixon's Southern strategy. It's conniving. It's brilliant. It's troubling. 1965, you have the march from Selma to Montgomery to register black voters who were attacked. And March 15th of that year, LBJ addresses the nation and pledges support and for civil rights. And on August 6, 1965, you have really the second of these two really important pieces of civil rights legislation, which is the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So this is big. This is not where the civil rights movement ends. This is another reason that I wanted you guys to watch that Black Panthers documentary, because so many of the documentaries on the civil rights movement act like when this was signed, it was over. We did it. No more racism, right? And you see in the Black Panthers documentary how much further that goes. And that's another thing. And it wasn't just about laws. Again, it's about treatment on the ground. It's about paying attention. It's about, eyes and ears actually being on the side of folks. And so, yeah. Now, in the end, though, you have huge changes in laws. And it takes a long time for these to take effect. And I will go on record as saying we ain't there yet, so keep fighting. And even when we are there, keep fighting, because there is a tendency to get complacent and to let things slide. But let's talk about the reasons why the civil rights movement is so successful. One, unquestionably, the active resistance by the people who fought and got in the streets. No question. All of this kind of is key there. But as I said, you can't understand why they're willing to go in the streets if you don't understand World War II. And I mentioned this in a previous lecture, that these folks had gone and fought in one of the country's great moments. It was a historic moment that people knew mattered when it was happening, and it was impossible to come back and write the black soldiers out of that story. So for a lot of white folks, they saw and fought on the same side as black soldiers. They saw them out there. Historically, the military has been a great leveler when it comes to race, because you know what? They're not gonna not shoot you because of your skin color. You're all wearing the same uniform. But also because you had mobilized a country of people on the basis of securing basic rights and freedoms and the safety of people on the other side of the world. If they ran at tanks and guns to save someone else's liberties, don't be surprised when they come back and are willing to do it for their own and for those around them who they love. We also talked about television, how important television is in bringing the civil rights movement into people's homes, evoking empathy. But there's another kicker that a lot of people leave out, and it is crucial. And that is that at the same time this is happening in the U.S., in the rest of the world, the United States is engaged in a heated battle for the hearts and minds of the world's population. The Cold War, friends, is a huge reason why the civil rights movement works. You ever wondered why a Texas Democrat seems so committed to the issue of civil rights? You ever wonder why Eisenhower is so adamant about sending in the military? Sure, maybe they're decent people. LBJ, a questionable record. But it has a lot to do with the fact that every single time there's something like what happened in 1957 in Little Rock, or what happens in Alabama in the early 1960s, that stuff gets recorded and makes news. And that is terrible PR when you are trying to tell the people of the world that you are the leading force for freedom and human rights, when the Soviet Union is sharing all over the world on shortwave radio everything you're doing at home to your own citizens to keep them from having equal rights. So just to step back here, quick recap. The Cold War creates an intense international competition between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, and a big part of this is winning influence abroad. After the end of World War II, England, France, all these major empires begin to break down, and that means that in their place there are independent countries. And in those independent countries, the new governments have to make a decision. Which way do they want to go? Do they want to go with the United States, or do they want to go with the Soviet Union? Or do they want to see that that's totally a false dichotomy and go in their own direction? The Soviets and the U.S. have a hard time imagining that's even an option, but they do a couple of them. So here's the pitch. Let's say you're Ghana and you're independent in 1957. Okay, Ghana's like, hey, trying to figure out what kind of a government we want to have, and the U.S. shows up and is like, hey, come with us. Come with us. Look at us, superpower. We created the atomic bomb. Greatest standard of living. I mean, we are awesome. You should come with us, and we will totally help you build yourselves into a really happy, healthy democracy where people can have lots of liberties and freedoms. That's a pretty good pitch, especially coming from the most powerful economic entity that's ever been on the earth. But here's the problem. You get that pitch, and then it comes time for pitch number 2 from the Soviets. The Soviets come in and they're like, guys, I'm hearing this American guy is talking to you, telling you all about freedom of the United States, all about democracy. It's true, they are stronger now, but we are growing faster. Also, the revolution was in 1700s. Ours was just when I was a little boy. So you could wait, or you could have now superpower. Also, black delegate from Ghana, maybe you should go see this damn United States. Maybe you should fly into airport outside D.C. in Virginia. And maybe you should sit down for a restaurant, have a meal. Maybe then you will see American freedom. And this is literally part of the problem. The United States is trying to recruit countries in Africa and Asia, i.e. people who are not white, people who historically haven't been treated the best in the United States. And at the same time that the United States is like, come with us, we love freedom. Literally delegates who are visiting the United States from other countries are being denied the opportunity to sit down in restaurants and have meals there. The images of what's going on in the United States are being broadcast around the world, and people are going, that's weird. So those guys who hate black people, they're going to come help us out? Have they seen us? That's an issue. And so in this competition, the U.S. is losing major ground. And we're all saying the Soviets, man, they don't respect individual liberties, They're all about, they don't have freedom. They're forced to do things by the government And then the Soviets are like, really? You mean like this? Are they forced to be beaten in the streets? Because it seems like that can't be the thing that differentiates us if you're right. And this is a big part of it. The U.S. and even the CIA is involved in underground activities, some above ground, some underground, to actually spread art and culture from the United States around the world, to improve our image, particularly in regards to Black Americans. They're the Voice of America radio stations, which broadcast American music, which is supposed to be banned in the Soviet Union. Broadcast it around. That's the problem. Jazz is awesome. The Soviets want it. The Soviet citizens want it. The Soviet government's like, no, it's chaotic, it's force of capitalism. But later on, they have to give up because people like it too much and they can't stop it. So they're like, okay, we have changed mind. Now is creative art of repressed Black people in the United States. We are in solidarity. It's a really weird, big shift all at once. The U.S. sends Cold War ambassadors. From 56 to 70, they send Dizzy Gillespie, Duke Ellington, some of the most famous musicians in the United States who are Black, around the world to go on State Department-sponsored tours to demonstrate the United States has Black folks and we love them and they're cool and you can see them. The Harlem Globetrotters are a part of this. And I've gotten the extras file, a whole episode of my podcast, The Road to Now, that we did on the Globetrotters. Globetrotters used to be legitimately the best team in the world. They weren't even from Harlem. They were from Chicago. They just called themselves the Harlem Globetrotters because it was during the Depression and they were trying to get people to come out. And saying Harlem during the Harlem Renaissance was a way to make people know you were Black without saying you were Black. So they called themselves the Harlem Globetrotters. And when the NBA started, it was segregated. The Harlem Globetrotters were so good, but Black folks couldn't play in the league. The NBA could not get people to show up and watch NBA games because it was boring. Because, again, when you only pick people from one group, you're not going to get the best sports. So the NBA couldn't get people to come out. They started hiring the Globetrotters to come in and play opening games against the home team so that people would actually come to the games. But the problem was that the NBA games, people would come see the Globetrotters play, and then they would leave before the actual NBA game. So they started having the NBA game be the opener at the NBA game so that people would get there early and then stick around and watch the Globetrotters play. Eventually, the league desegregated, and some of the Globetrotters were some of the first folks, Black folks, who went into the NBA. In the meantime, having this famous, amazing Black basketball team that was, the symbol in the United States, the State Department saw that, sent them around the world to play the national teams of all these countries. And you guys know how the Globetrotters always play like that team, the Washington Generals? And by the way, the Globetrotters now are very different than they used to be, right? Eventually they become like a lot about entertainment. But the reason they even started traveling with the team was because after a while, the Globetrotters, people wanted to see the Globetrotters play, but countries got tired of the Globetrotters showing up and just routing their national teams. So they made them bring a team with them to beat in front of everybody so they didn't look dumb in front of their own populations. The Globetrotters played a basketball game in Germany. It was the most attended basketball game on earth until recently. This is all to show, no, we're not that bad, really. We like Black folks. Look, here's some. Another thing that happens is the CIA actually secretly funds abstract art. You guys ever seen abstract art like this? And you're like, I could do that. Actually, that's actually what your uncle says. Your uncle's like, what is that? Would somebody just throw some paint at some canvas? The CIA actually secretly funded these folks, and they didn't know about it because they knew it would make the Soviets so upset to see non-kind of traditional art that this was a way of subjugating and getting different forms in to undermine Soviet culture. And finally, one of the things they do that I think we can all admire is the Fulbright program set up to send Americans to study abroad and gain knowledge about the outside world and represent our country. The Fulbright program is amazing. It is still in place. And this part of the podcast is brought to you by me, Dr. Sawyer. I'm on a Fulbright committee at MTSU. I'm on a Fulbright committee at the national level. I've been a former Fulbright scholar. So ask me if you want to apply for a Fulbright and we'll talk about it. I will help you. One last thing. In 1954, when the court was meeting to decide on Brown versus the Board of Education, there was a memo passed by the executive office that asked the court to remember the implications of their decision, that the world's eyes were on them, and that they should make sure to do what was best for the country. That is a rare case where outside forces will intervene in a Supreme Court decision. And basically the message was, if you do not pass this, the Soviet Union is going to skewer us in the international press. We like to think that this was all one day people woke up and were like, we've been treating people different because they have different color skin. That's so stupid. But it wasn't. And if you want to understand why the federal government gets so on board with the civil rights movement at that moment in time, you can't miss out on the Cold War and the fact that we are in it. Speaking of in it, boom, Cuba. You guys remember Cuba? Last time we saw it, we were like, hey, you guys are free. And then we were like, psych, you guys are, you are free. It's all right. We meant to say you're free, but you can't do what you want to. You just have to ask us. But you're free. But you can't. Don't make any decisions. You have to ask. We'll take away your leadership. We'll put our own person in charge. But you're free to do what you want to. But if you do that, we'll take away your opportunity to make decisions. You guys remember that? 1898 and then the Platt Amendment after that? So as it turns out, that's a pretty good place for a small handful of people who are very wealthy. Not a real good place for a lot of people who are poor. This guy Fidel Castro comes in, which, by the way, people have told me in the past that I look like Fidel Castro. Here's the story in short. Fidel Castro, this guy, he's a communist, but he's also a nationalist. And this is important to remember. Cuban people are sick and tired of being under the thumb of a foreign power. They had Spain for a long time, and then boom, they've got the United States, and now they want to have some degree of independence. And a part of that means taking away the property of foreign businesses so that that can be controlled and the benefits of it go to the people who live on the island. This guy named Batista, he had seized the power in a coup in 1952. Castro leads a revolution against him. Castro is wildly popular when he wins. Now, retrospect, maybe we don't agree with what he does, but anyway, at the time, he's wildly popular. Let's back off, though, because the United States is furious about this. You want to know how mad they are about this? They're so mad about this in 1959 that they're still mad about this. People are still mad about this. This is seriously like spitefully refusing to buy something off of eBay that you really need because it turns out it belongs to your ex-girlfriend from high school and you're 70. Here's what we do in response. The United States government, according to records, tries to kill Fidel Castro somewhere between 8 and 638 times. That's a pretty big spread. 638 is what the Cubans say. They're like, dude, you try to kill our guy 638 times. But our official response is, nuh-uh, we only tried to kill him 8 times, which is not actually a very good response to the number of times you've possibly tried to kill the leader of another country. On April 17th, 1961, Bay of Pigs invasion, long and short, it was an Eisenhower plan he never carried through. Kennedy takes it over, and Kennedy, remember, my favorite line about Kennedy is that John F. Kennedy wanted more than anything to win the Cold War, but he did not know what that meant. Pulls the trigger on this invasion, but doesn't send any backup, so all the folks that we trained from Cuba to try to make it look like we weren't involved, they just get caught and are killed, fails miserably, and guess what? People find out that we were totally involved anyway. Then in October of 1962, we find out that there are missiles in Cuba, and they might be atomic weapons from the Soviets. They've been transporting there. The U.S. is furious, confronts them directly. And over the 13 days in 1962, John F. Kennedy stares them down, tells them, get them out of there, and saves us. Although, according to Benjamin Schwartz in the reading you're going to do today, which actually makes pretty good sense, Kennedy makes it public, makes everyone terrified that the country is going to explode, and now he can't back down. So instead of actually talking to Khrushchev about what everyone knew that Khrushchev wanted, this is the leader of the Soviet Union, that Khrushchev actually just wanted the weapons out of Turkey that could hit the USSR, Kennedy makes it public, and in the end gives more concessions than he actually had to. So there we go. In the end, Kennedy, we didn't go to war. But what else? Just letting you guys know, we're still mad at Cuba. We're still mad at Cuba. Can you think of someone in elementary school who borrowed something and never gave it back? Can you think of someone? Dude, I had this dope SeaWorld kit. I didn't get to go to SeaWorld. I wasn't that rich, but my grandma went down to Florida or something, brought me back this awesome SeaWorld pencil kit. All right, no animals were harmed in the making of this, so y'all calm down. And I loved it. And I put it in my cubby. Dude, some kid stole it. I think it was this dirtbag kid named Randy. But anyway, all right. In retrospect, I'm not still mad at him. I'm not. I'm over it at the world level. This is so much in one. Let's go to space. All right. So while this is all going down, The USSR is also, not only they got like an aircraft carrier of an island off our base under their thumbs, which, by the way, you know why the Cubans decided to join up with the Soviets? You want to know why? Maybe it's because we tried to kill their president somewhere between 8 and 638 times. And maybe, just maybe, if someone was trying to do that to us and somebody was like, we have guns, you want the guns, you want the weapons? We'd be like, dude, buy it from that guy, all right? We don't like him, but you know what? We need protection. Enemy of my enemy is my friend. Which is a pretty good summary of the way it went down. But at the same time, the Soviets are beating us into space, guys. October 4th, 1957, USSR launched Sputnik, the first satellite ever to go into space, and it made a noise, and people were terrified in the United States. I mean, I can't even tell you. People were like, it's up there. People were like, they're over us. They're like, and it just went. That's what it did. And people were still like, it's booping up there. It's booping on top of us. Is it booping at us? Can it boop at us without us seeing it? Oh my God, I think I see it. People were terrified. Like 15 years ago, Popular Mechanics, the magazine, published an article on how you could make a Sputnik out of items you have laying around your house, like remote controls and stuff like that. But at the time, that was still terrifying. So, boom, they're out there. They're already ahead of us. Everybody knows about Sputnik, right? That the Soviets got there first. But nobody ever talks about Vanguard 2. Like, people are like, well, they got up there first. It's like, yeah, but 2 months later, we had Vanguard 2. Check this out.
Is classified. Neither the satellite program nor our missile development is affected, said Acting Defense Secretary Quarles. It's only an incident in the perfection of the Vanguard satellite system.
It's only an incident, that's all. It's also known as Flopnik, by the way. That's what this is called. So what I'm saying is it's not looking too good for us going into space. But don't worry, because we're going to move forward, right? We're going to win because we always win. Isn't that right? You guys, we always win, right? You guys, we always win. Cool. But not just yet. On September 14th, 1959, they landed the first man-made object on the moon called Luna 2. And on August 19th, 1960, the Soviets sent the first dog into space. No, I did not Photoshop that picture right there. That is an actual picture of the apparatus they sent the dog Laika into space in. And I should say, some people say Laika was the first dog in space. I'm not so sure. I think maybe it was just the first one to come back.
Ваше благородие, госпожа разлука, мне с тобою холодно, вот какая штука. Письмецо в конверте, погоди, не рви, не везет мне в смерти, повезет в любви. Письмецо в конверте, погоди, не рви, не везет мне в смерти, повезет в любви.
Look at it. It's smiling. It's like, let's go, dude. That's how it talked. I know you guys are like, they just shot a rocket, like Luna 2, they just shot something onto the moon. It's like, dude, they shot something onto the moon. Like, they were like, you see that? You see that up there? You see that? Watch this. And they hit it. And then on April 12, 1961, the USSR sent the first man into space. Yuri Gagarin. Actually, I should say this. First man who went into space and came back. These are the first words ever from space. I see Earth. It is so beautiful. Right? That's sweet. That's sweet. Then he had to be a jackass about it. And he was like, I don't see God up here. Which is, I don't know who thinks that God lived in space, honestly. I don't think that's a burn. I don't think anybody was like, oh my God, really? Because I thought God lived in space and the devil lived in the earth. I don't think that's actually how people think about these things. Vanguard 2, just a minor setback, remember? But the United States catches up. JFK calls to the country to respond to the Soviet challenge. JFK asked Congress to fund what became the Apollo program. And on July 20th, 1969, Apollo 11, first people to walk on the moon. So boom there, what's up now? We won, right? You guys remember what's the capital of the moon? Hey, Simon, what's the capital of the moon?
America!
That's right, that's right. So, you know how people are like, why don't we go to the moon anymore? Well, did you ever wonder why we actually went to the moon in the first place? Did you, Solomon?
Yes.
It's because the reason that we go to the moon, the Cold War, let me tell you this, and this is something that people don't get. So much of the technological advancement we made, so much of these huge steps were done to demonstrate the United States' superiority over the Soviet Union. We don't think about it like that. That's not the way we want to think about it. We want to be like, well, we were just America and we did it. But if you don't understand that the United States was in this competition with the Soviet Union, you miss it. So you know how empires before this, the thing that empires did was they took over the world? They demonstrated their superiority by taking a literal physical place, taking over the people, proving, as Rudyard Kipling called it, the white man's burden, that you could civilize other people, right? That old imperialist way of doing things. But what happens in the Cold War is that people don't do it like that anymore. Because now you've got this mantra of human rights. And when you're talking about human rights, you can't just go conquer people. Because that's bad. We know that, right? We got human rights, we got sovereignty, we're just trying to help out democracy. So now you don't have really a good place to prove your superiority. So what you end up doing to prove to the world that you are the most advanced country is you take the places that there aren't any people. And the places that haven't been taken where there aren't any people are pretty terrible places in terms of life. Pretty hard places to live, hard places to get to. All of this shapes the innovation and the conquest of nature that happens in the Cold War. So much of this is about proving that you can take over nature. And we're willing to go to extreme lengths to do it. You guys know about Werner von Braun and Project Paperclip?
The Nazi?
Yeah. The United States basically made cover for Nazi scientists through the CIA and brought them back to the United States to work on our space programs and our missile programs. Werner von Braun, who the Von Braun Center in Huntsville, Alabama is named after, was one of these folks. And the amazing thing is not only did they have scientists that were really good at understanding physics, propulsion and all that, space is really, really rough on the body. Some of the scientists had some experience testing the bounds of human mortality because they had worked in Holocaust experiments. Just a couple years ago, it was discovered that another person, a member of the Nazi Party, had escaped and was living in New York. Someone discovered that he was a part of the Nazis, but it was really hard to catch him. But the one thing they got him on was they went back to his original records, and he had lied on his entry papers and said he had never been in the Nazi Party. The guy was about to go on trial, and this guy was ancient. He was about to go on trial less than 24 hours before the trial began. The CIA intervened and said, we forged those papers for him. Whole project to bring these folks back. Sometimes wanting to win big means, But hey, don't worry, because we look awesome. But we don't always win, though, is the thing. We don't always win, right? Because, let's just face this. The battle for the deepest hole, all right? That's one that actually goes down. Because you know what I'm saying? Who's going to dig a deeper hole? All right, so the battle for the deeper hole. When this all starts off, Bertha Rogers #1 in Washita County, Oklahoma was the deepest hole in the world, 5.95 miles deep on April 13, 1974. And we were like, we got it on lock. We got the deepest hole. You know what I'm saying? Because this isn't the Cold War. This isn't real life. This is just two kids in a sandbox trying to dig the deepest hole. So we're winning. What's up? 5.95 miles deep. So that we could actually drilling for something, right? It's like an oil well. Okay, but the Soviets are like, nah, we got you. And they end up winning. They build the Kola Super Deep Borehole, and they break the record in 1989. The Kola Super Deep Borehole, okay? Let's say it together. Kola Super Deep Borehole. How deep is it? Super deep. What is it? A borehole. Where is it? Kola. Is it deep? Super deep. It's a super deep borehole. 7.216 miles deep. That's super deep. And they win. And the Soviet Union collapses, and it's just abandoned because there wasn't really a reason to be doing it except for to show how awesome you were with this deep hole. Super deep hole, actually. A super deep borehole is what it is. Favorite story about this? You guys ever see those TV preachers? The ones that are always like, knocking people down and casting, like, what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about preachers. I'm talking about some of these TV preachers. You know what I'm saying? Well, this Kola super deep borehole, super deep, but they stopped drilling it because the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union ran out of money. They just abandoned it, right? But it was super deep. It was the deepest hole ever made. It was the Kola super deep borehole. So they just stopped drilling it because it was already super deep, but they ran out of money. So this guy, the scientist, was watching TV and saw one of these preachers on TV that was like just making up garbage, This guy was like, I'll bet that guy doesn't actually check anything. So that guy sent out a Finnish language newspaper article about gardening or something, claimed to have translated it into English, sent the translation to this guy, and the story was that in Finland, some scientists had fled into the country. The scientists were working on the super deep borehole, and they had gotten super deep in this borehole, and they were in Kola. But the problem was that they got so deep that they heard soul in the earth. Because remember, God's in space and the devil is in the middle of the earth, right? Last time I checked, right? So this guy sends it in, and then he cuts some B-rate movie footage of some demons screaming and puts it on a tape, mails it to this guy, and is like, I'll bet this guy will just play this and say that it's true. And he did. And in fact, if you go back and look, when I was a kid in youth group, I heard this story. The story was he had gotten so deep, and the reason that the Kola super deep borehole shut down was because they heard demons screaming in it, and they closed it after that. Be skeptical. Everyone knows that it was super deep. It even has a stamp. But the Soviets got to Antarctica. That's the thing. We couldn't get there. Polar inaccessibility, the hardest place to get to. The Soviets got there, and they put up a bust of Soviet leader Vladimir Lenin that is still there today. You've got to be tough to get there. So we won space, but they won the deepest hole, and they won the point of inaccessibility. You want to know how tough you've got to be there? Only a couple people can go at a time, and you only got one doctor. What happens if that doctor needs medical care because the doctor's spleen actually exploded while he was there? What would you do? That's right. You would cut your own spleen out without using any numbing agents. Without using any anesthetics. You would set up a mirror and you would cut, appendix. His appendix burst. And you would cut out your own appendix. How's that? You know where else the Cold War does lead us? Some places that we maybe shouldn't have gone. That's the lecture for today. I'm Dr. Sawyer. Thanks for being here. Have someone else remove your appendix, please. Don't do it yourself. Trust me, I'm a doctor. Thanks.